3 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the hallway, and the atmosphere at Windsor Castle had settled into a new kind of normal. Rebecca continued her duties with the same dedication she had always shown, but she was acutely aware that her relationship with certain members of the royal household had permanently changed. Camilla was polite but distant when their paths crossed, and some of the administrative staff who had previously been friendly now treated her with cool professionalism. However, Rebecca had also noticed positive changes that she hadn't expected. Several of her fellow guards had privately thanked her for taking a stand on principle. Word of her defense of the Queen's wishes had spread through the security staff, and it had reinforced their shared commitment to putting the Queen's interests above political maneuvering. More importantly, Queen Elizabeth herself had begun acknowledging Rebecca with small nods and genuine smiles during their brief encounters. On this particular morning, Rebecca was surprised to receive a message that Commander Stevens wanted to see her in his office. As she walked through the administrative corridors, her mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps there had been a complaint filed against her after all, or maybe there were still repercussions from her stand 3 weeks ago. Commander Stevens' office was a study in military efficiency, with commendations and photographs from his 30-year career covering the walls. He looked up from his paperwork as Rebecca entered and came to attention. "At ease, Sergeant Major. Please, have a seat." Rebecca sat down, maintaining her professional posture while trying to read Stevens' expression. He seemed neither angry nor particularly pleased, just thoughtful. "I'd been reflecting on the events of 3 weeks ago," he began, leaning back in his chair. "Your actions put me in a difficult position, as I'm sure you understand." "Yes, sir. I recognize that my decision created complications for you." Stevens nodded. "However, I've also come to realize that you were absolutely correct in your assessment of the situation. The Queen's well-being and preferences should indeed take precedence over other considerations, even when those considerations come from very influential sources." Rebecca felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she remained silent, sensing that Stevens had more to say. "I've received a personal request from Her Majesty," he continued, picking up a formal document from his desk. "She has asked that you be assigned as her primary personal protection officer for all activities within the castle grounds. It's a significant promotion, with a substantial increase in responsibility and compensation." The news hit Rebecca like a thunderbolt. The position of primary personal protection officer was one of the most prestigious and trusted roles in the royal security apparatus. It meant constant proximity to the Queen, involvement in security planning at the highest levels, and recognition as one of her most valued staff members. "Sir, I'm honored by Her Majesty's confidence," Rebecca managed, still processing the magnitude of what Stevens had just told her. "The Queen specifically mentioned your unwavering commitment to my well-being and your courage in defending my personal preferences even when faced with significant pressure," Stevens read from the document. Those are her exact words. As Rebecca walked back through the castle corridors toward the Queen's private wing, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the space of a few weeks. Her willingness to risk her career for what she believed was right had not only been vindicated but had led to the greatest professional opportunity of her life. When she arrived at the Queen's study to begin her new duties, she found Her Majesty sitting in her usual chair, cup of tea in hand, gazing at the portrait that had started it all. The morning light caught the brushstrokes just as it had 3 weeks ago, but now Rebecca saw it with new understanding. This wasn't just a painting to the Queen, it was a source of strength, a reminder of promises made and kept, a connection to the young woman who had accepted the enormous responsibility of the crown. "Ah, Sergeant Major Hayes," the Queen said, looking up with a warm smile. "I trust Commander Stevens has informed you of your new assignment?" "Yes, Your Majesty. I'm deeply honored by your confidence in me." The Queen set down her teacup and studied Rebecca's face. "Do you know why I chose you for this position?" "I hope it's because you believe I can protect you effectively, Your Majesty." "That's certainly part of it," the Queen replied. "But, more importantly, you demonstrated something quite rare in recent years, the courage to put my actual interests above what others assumed my interests should be. You understood that sometimes protecting someone means protecting not just their physical safety, but their emotional and spiritual well-being as well." Rebecca felt a deep sense of validation at these words. "Your Majesty, I simply tried to do what I felt was right." "Exactly," the Queen said, rising from her chair and moving to stand before the portrait. "This painting reminds me every day of who I was when I made my coronation oath. That young woman promised to serve her people with dedication and integrity until her dying day. Sometimes I look at her and wonder if I've lived up to that promise." Rebecca joined the Queen in front of the portrait, seeing it now not just as a beautiful work of art but as a sacred reminder of a life dedicated to service. "Your Majesty, if I may say so, that young woman in the painting would be proud of who you've become. Your dedication to your people and your principles has been unwavering for over 70 years. The Queen smiled, and, for a moment, Rebecca could see the young woman from the portrait shining through the eyes of the elderly monarch. "Thank you, Sergeant Major. That means more to me than you might realize." As the weeks passed in Rebecca's new role, she gained a deeper understanding of the Queen's daily life and the pressures she faced from various quarters. She witnessed other attempts by different family members and advisors to influence decisions about the Queen's personal spaces, her schedule, and her public appearances. Each time, Rebecca's presence served as a subtle reminder that the Queen's own wishes should be paramount. The portrait incident had established an important precedent. When other changes were suggested for the Queen's private areas, Rebecca would quietly ask whether Her Majesty had been consulted. Usually, this simple question was enough to ensure that proper protocol was followed. The Queen's trust in Rebecca grew steadily, and she began sharing more personal thoughts and concerns during their daily interactions. One afternoon, as they walked through the gardens during the Queen's daily exercise, Her Majesty brought up the portrait incident directly. "You know, Sergeant Major, that morning when you stood up to Camilla wasn't just about a painting." "What do you mean, Your Majesty?" "It was about respect," the Queen said, pausing to admire a particularly beautiful rose bush. "Respect for my autonomy, my preferences, and my right to make decisions about my own life. As one gets older, people increasingly make decisions for you rather than with you, often with the best of intentions. But good intentions don't make up for the loss of dignity that comes with being treated like a child." Rebecca understood completely. "Your Majesty, you've earned the right to have your wishes respected and your voice heard." "Indeed. And you ensured that my voice was heard that day, even when it was difficult to do so." Months later, Rebecca would often look back on that confrontation in the hallway as the defining moment of her career. It had taught her that true service sometimes required courage, and that protecting someone meant more than just ensuring their physical safety. It meant defending their dignity, their autonomy, and their right to make decisions about their own life. The portrait still hung in its place of honor in the Queen's study, continuing to provide daily inspiration to a monarch who had never wavered from the promises she made as a young woman. And Rebecca continued her service with the knowledge that she had helped preserve not just a painting, but a vital source of strength for one of the most remarkable women in history. In the end, standing up for what was right had not cost Rebecca her career, it had elevated it beyond her wildest dreams. But, more importantly, it had reinforced her understanding that true honor came not from following orders blindly, but from having the courage to do what was right, even when it was difficult. The Queen's trust in Rebecca became legendary throughout the royal household. Staff members would later say that they had never seen Her Majesty form such a strong bond with a security officer. Rebecca had earned this trust not through flattery or political maneuvering, but through a simple act of courage in defense of the Queen's dignity and personal preferences. Years later, when Rebecca would tell this story to new guards joining the Royal Protection Detail, she would always emphasize the same lesson: true service requires not just obedience, but the wisdom to know when protecting someone means standing up for their rights and dignity, even against powerful opposition. The portrait that had sparked the confrontation continued to hang in the Queen's study, a daily reminder of promises kept and principles maintained, watching over a monarch who had never forgotten the oath she took as a young woman to serve her people with unwavering dedication. The next morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to penetrate even the thick stone walls of Windsor Castle. Rebecca had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her career. As she prepared for her shift, her fellow guards offered quiet words of support, but she could see the worry in their eyes. They all knew that challenging someone with Camilla's influence was dangerous territory. At precisely 9:30, Rebecca took her position outside the Queen's study. Her uniform was immaculate, her bearing proud, but her stomach churned with nervous energy. She had made her decision, and now she would face whatever consequences came with it. The Queen had been in her study since 8 o'clock, as was her custom. Rebecca had caught a glimpse of her through the partially open door, sitting in her favorite chair with a cup of tea, gazing at the portrait that had sparked yesterday's confrontation. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated the painting beautifully, and Rebecca could understand why it meant so much to Her Majesty. At 5 minutes to 10, the sound of multiple footsteps echoed through the corridor. Camilla approached with a larger entourage than the day before, her personal assistant, 2 men Rebecca didn't recognize who were probably art handlers, and, most concerning of all, Commander William Stevens, the head of palace security. Rebecca's heart sank. Camilla had clearly escalated the matter to the highest levels. "Sergeant Major Hayes," Commander Stevens said as the group approached. His expression was carefully neutral, but Rebecca could see the tension in his posture. "The Duchess of Cornwall has informed me of yesterday's conversation. I need you to step aside so that the art handlers can complete their assigned task." Rebecca looked at her superior officer, a man she had worked with for over a decade. She could see the conflict in his eyes. He was being forced to choose between supporting his subordinate and maintaining the delicate political balance of the royal household. "Sir," Rebecca said quietly, "I respectfully request to speak with Her Majesty before any changes are made to her private study. This is her personal space, and she should have input on modifications to it." Commander Stevens glanced at Camilla, whose expression had hardened into barely controlled fury. "Sergeant Major, the decision has been made by the proper authorities. Your job is to follow orders, not to question them." "With respect, sir," Rebecca replied, her voice growing stronger, "my oath was to serve and protect the Queen. Part of that service includes protecting her interests and well-being. I believe removing this portrait without her knowledge would be detrimental to both." The art handlers stood uncomfortably to the side, clearly wanting no part of the brewing confrontation. One of them, an elderly man with gentle eyes, kept glancing toward the study door as if hoping the Queen herself would emerge and resolve the situation. Camilla stepped forward, her voice sharp with authority. "This is intolerable. Sergeant Major Hayes, you are deliberately obstructing a direct order. Commander Stevens, I expect this matter to be resolved immediately." The tension in the hallway reached a breaking point. Rebecca could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, waiting to see if she would back down or continue her stand. She thought about her career, her pension, and her future. But then, she thought about the Queen's face when she looked at that portrait, the way it seemed to remind her of the young woman who had accepted the crown and all its burdens with such grace and determination. "I understand the consequences of my actions," Rebecca said, addressing both Commander Stevens and Camilla. "But I cannot and will not participate in removing something of such obvious importance to Her Majesty without her explicit consent." At that moment, the study door opened wider, and Queen Elizabeth stepped into the doorway. She was dressed in a simple day dress, her hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence that had guided the monarchy for over 7 decades. "Is there some sort of disturbance in my hallway?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly. The entire group immediately straightened and bowed. Commander Stevens stepped forward first. "Your Majesty, we were just handling some routine maintenance in your study." The Queen's eyes moved slowly across the assembled group, taking in Camilla's tense expression, the nervous art handlers, and Rebecca's rigid military bearing. Her gaze lingered on Rebecca for a moment longer than the others. "Routine maintenance," the Queen repeated slowly. "And what sort of maintenance requires such a large gathering and such obvious tension?" Camilla stepped forward, her voice carefully modulated. "Mother, we were simply going to refresh some of the artwork in your study. Some pieces have been there for so long, and we thought a change might be pleasant." "I see," the Queen said. "And which pieces were you planning to change?" There was a long pause. Camilla glanced at the art handlers, then back at the Queen. "We thought the large portrait on the far wall might benefit from rotation into storage." Perhaps something more contemporary could take its place. The Queen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a flash of steel that reminded everyone present why she had successfully navigated decades of political upheaval and family drama. "The portrait of myself as a young queen," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Camilla replied, her voice growing slightly defensive. "I thought it might be less emotionally taxing for you to have something different to look at during your daily reflection time." The Queen was silent for several long moments. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet but carried the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "Camilla," she said, "I appreciate your concern for my emotional well-being. However, that portrait has been in my study for 31 years. I chose its placement myself, and I look at it every morning as a reminder of the promises I made on my coronation day. It is not emotionally taxing, it is inspiring." The hallway fell into complete silence. Even the normal background sounds of the castle seemed to fade away. "Sergeant Major Hayes," the Queen continued, turning to Rebecca. "Did you object to the removal of my portrait?" Rebecca straightened even more if that was possible. "Yes, Your Majesty. I felt that changes to your personal space should be made with your knowledge and approval." "I see. And you understood that objecting could have consequences for your career?" "Yes, Your Majesty." The Queen nodded slowly. "Commander Stevens, Sergeant Major Hayes was correct to bring this matter to my attention. Any changes to my private spaces should indeed be discussed with me first. I believe that demonstrates proper protocol, not insubordination." Commander Stevens looked relieved. "Yes, Your Majesty. I understand completely." The Queen then turned her full attention to Camilla. "My dear, I understand that you meant well, but that portrait stays exactly where it is. It reminds me daily of who I was when I accepted this responsibility, and it helps me remember why I continue to carry it. I would be quite distressed if it were removed without my knowledge." Camilla's face had grown pale, but she maintained her composure. "Of course, Mother. I simply wanted to help." "And I appreciate that intention," the Queen replied gently but firmly. "However, in the future, please discuss such matters with me directly before making arrangements. Now, I believe these gentlemen can return to their other duties, as their services are not needed here today." The art handlers practically fled down the hallway, clearly grateful to escape the tense situation. Commander Stevens excused himself with obvious relief, and Camilla's advisors melted away like shadows. Camilla herself lingered for a moment, her eyes moving between the Queen and Rebecca. There was something in her expression, not quite defeat, but certainly a recognition that this particular battle was over. "Of course, Mother," she said finally. "I'll remember that in the future." As Camilla walked away, the Queen remained in her doorway for a moment longer, her eyes meeting Rebecca's. "Sergeant Major," she said quietly, "thank you for your service." "It's my honor, Your Majesty." The Queen smiled, a small, genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "Indeed it is. Carry on." As the Queen returned to her study, Rebecca resumed her position with a profound sense of relief and validation. She had taken a stand for what she believed was right, and it had been vindicated. But she also knew that this confrontation had changed something fundamental in the dynamics of the palace, and that the consequences of her actions would ripple through the royal household in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Sergeant Major Rebecca Hayes adjusted her ceremonial sword one final time before taking her position outside the Queen's private study at Windsor Castle. The morning sun cast long shadows through the ancient corridors, and the familiar weight of her uniform felt heavier than usual. After 15 years of dedicated service to the crown, she had earned her place among the most trusted guards in the royal household. The hushed whispers of the staff had been growing louder over the past weeks. Queen Elizabeth II, now in her 90s, had been spending increasing amounts of time in her private study, often staring at the magnificent oil painting that dominated the far wall. The portrait, commissioned during her coronation year, showed her as a young woman, radiant in her ceremonial robes with the crown jewels gleaming against the rich blue background. It was more than just a painting, it was a symbol of her reign, her dedication, and the promise she had made to serve her people until her dying day. Rebecca had noticed how the Queen's eyes would linger on that portrait during their brief conversations. There was something almost mystical about the way the morning light would catch the brushstrokes, making the young Queen in the painting seem almost alive. The artist had captured not just her physical beauty, but the determination and strength that had carried her through decades of service. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the marble hallway. Rebecca straightened, recognizing the distinctive click of expensive heels against stone. The Duchess of Cornwall, Camilla, approached with her usual entourage of assistants and advisors. Her face wore an expression that Rebecca had learned to recognize over the years, the look of someone who had made a decision and would not be easily swayed from it. "Good morning, Sergeant Major Hayes," Camilla said, her voice carrying the authority that came with her position. "I need to speak with you about arrangements for the Queen's study." Rebecca maintained her professional composure, though something in the Duchess's tone made her wary. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. How may I assist you?" Camilla glanced toward the closed door of the study, then back at Rebecca. "There are going to be some changes made to the room's decor. The Queen has been feeling a bit overwhelmed by some of the older pieces, and we believe a more contemporary atmosphere would be beneficial for her well-being." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow, though she kept her expression neutral. She knew exactly what Camilla was referring to. The portrait of the young Queen Elizabeth had been the subject of whispered discussions among certain members of the royal household. Some felt it was a painful reminder of age and time's passage, while others saw it as an inspiration and source of strength. "I understand your concern for Her Majesty's comfort," Rebecca replied carefully. "However, any changes to her private study would typically require her direct approval, particularly regarding items of personal significance." Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sergeant Major, I appreciate your dedication, but you must understand that as the future Queen Consort, I have both the authority and responsibility to make decisions that are in the Queen's best interest. The portrait will be removed tomorrow morning and placed in storage." "This is not a request, it is an instruction." Rebecca felt her heart rate increase, but her voice remained steady. "Your Royal Highness, with the greatest respect, the portrait you're referring to holds immense personal value to Her Majesty. I've observed her with it many times, and I believe she finds great comfort in its presence." "You've observed her?" Camilla's voice took on a sharp edge. "Sergeant Major, your role is to provide security, not to play therapist or advisor to the Queen. The decision has been made by those with the proper authority to make it." The tension in the hallway was palpable. Rebecca's fellow guards, stationed at various points along the corridor, had stopped their quiet conversations and were watching the exchange with growing concern. They all knew Rebecca's reputation for fairness and dedication, and they also knew how much the Queen valued that particular portrait. "Your Royal Highness," Rebecca said, choosing her words with extreme care, "perhaps we could arrange for Her Majesty to be consulted on this matter? I'm certain she would appreciate being included in decisions regarding her personal spaces." Camilla stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow managed to sound more threatening than if she had shouted. "Are you questioning my judgment, Sergeant Major? Are you suggesting that I don't have my mother-in-law's best interests at heart?" Rebecca could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Her entire career, her reputation, and her future were balanced on the edge of this conversation. She thought about the Queen's face when she looked at that portrait, the way her eyes would soften, the small smile that would cross her lips, the straightening of her shoulders as if drawing strength from the image of her younger self. "No, Your Royal Highness," Rebecca replied, her voice gaining strength. "I'm not questioning your intentions. However, I am respectfully suggesting that such a significant change should be discussed with Her Majesty before implementation. The portrait has been in that room for over 30 years. It's part of her daily environment, and removing it without her knowledge could be quite distressing." Camilla's face flushed with anger. "Sergeant Major Hayes, you are overstepping your bounds in the most inappropriate manner. I will not have a member of the guard staff lecturing me on protocol or decision-making. The portrait will be removed tomorrow at 10 o'clock sharp. If you have any objections to following this instruction, perhaps you should reconsider whether this position is suitable for you." The threat hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Rebecca knew that Camilla had the influence to end her career with a single conversation. She thought about her years of service, the bonds she had formed with her fellow guards, and the pension she was working toward. But, then, she thought about Queen Elizabeth, sitting in her study that very morning, probably looking at the portrait and drawing strength from it. "Your Royal Highness," Rebecca said, her voice now completely steady despite the storm raging inside her, "I understand your position, and I respect your authority. However, I cannot in good conscience participate in removing something of such personal importance to Her Majesty without her explicit consent. If that means my position is at risk, then I accept that consequence." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it was probably only seconds. Camilla's advisors shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting this level of resistance from a guard. The other security personnel in the corridor had gone completely still, hardly daring to breathe. "Very well," Camilla finally said, her voice ice-cold. "I can see where your loyalties lie, Sergeant Major. I will be speaking with the proper authorities about your insubordination. I suggest you use the next 24 hours to seriously reconsider your position." As Camilla and her entourage swept down the hallway, Rebecca remained at her post, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. She knew that the real battle was just beginning, and that her stand had put her on a collision course with one of the most powerful people in the royal household. The door to the Queen's study opened quietly, and Queen Elizabeth herself appeared in the doorway. Her keen eyes took in Rebecca's tense posture and the retreating figure of Camilla in the distance. "Sergeant Major," the Queen said quietly, "is everything quite all right?" Rebecca turned and offered a proper bow. "Yes, Your Majesty. Everything is well." But, as the Queen's perceptive gaze lingered on her face, Rebecca wondered if everything would still be well tomorrow, and whether her decision to stand up for what she believed was right would cost her everything she had worked for.